Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and this is my continuation of explanations for smoking. And it's the second part where we look at specifically the learning theory. Now, also in brackets, I have there is that they said that we should apply this to smoking behavior. So that just reminds me that when we talk about explanations, when we talk about anything within the addiction module, really important for paper 3 is that we don't talk about behavior in a generic way. We need to specifically talk about the addictive behavior that we're trying to explain, because as it becomes about kind of this idea that we talk about learning theory rather than actually trying to apply it to smoking behavior. Now, to introduce the learning theory, I kind of wanted to just refer to some research to highlight actually that it's very easy for us to find research that shows us that nicotine is rewarding and that nicotine can become highly addictive. Okay, and certainly we can use Skinner boxes. Okay, we see here Goldberg has some research with a Skinner box, and we find that we can very easily train a monkey. Okay, so this is a monkey that doesn't have the same capacity to kind of think things through like a human being, and yet they become as addicted to nicotine as they would be to cocaine. Okay, there's more research. It says here a dog would use several hundred responses to get a single injection of nicotine. So what this is just simply saying, quite literally, that they will learn to press a button, to press a lever again and again and again in order just to get an injection of nicotine. So it's highly kind of addictive. It's highly kind of rewarding, I suppose, is the best word to do it. So we see these studies, as said there, we can show that actually that the drug itself is very reinforcing. Okay, so nicotine itself is very reinforcing. However, I want you to think a little bit more clearly about this. So if nicotine itself is rewarding, okay, so it says here, there are many ways in which nicotine can get into your bloodstream. Why is it cigarettes that are addictive? Why aren't we popping pills? Why aren't we chewing the gum? Why aren't we using the spray? And I suppose this diagram is a very good example of that. What we see is that all three methods, we have the patch, we have the gum or inhaler, we have spray, all three of them can put nicotine. Now, this is just the kind of amount of nicotine we need to have into our system. They can put it into our system incredibly quickly, and it can be kind of mostly effective. But what we find is we have this peak here. There's something about a cigarette that is different to all these other things. So people become addicted to smoking rather than addicted to the patch. In fact, one of the ways in which they try to kind of take people off smoking cigarettes is to smoke via like some kind of e-cigarette or vaping. Now, we are yet unsure as to how safe those methods are, okay? Because it's actually the problem is the cigarette, okay? Because when we burn a leaf and we inhale that carcinogenic kind of burning thing, that's what causes cancer. That's what causes the problems. At the moment, there's not the problem is not so much the nicotine. It's kind of what we do with it. So for me, I'm hoping that this at least makes you start thinking that there's something specific about a cigarette. Okay, in the previous video, I did talk about this idea of kind of psychological, that smoking could be psychological. And I suppose one of the things you could argue is that somebody who's addicted to smoking is able to often delay smoking. If you get on an aeroplane where it says you cannot smoke, you'll wait 2 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, however long your flight may be, and not smoke a cigarette. Now, if it was purely biological, we'd find that you wouldn't fly, you wouldn't go on an airplane because you wouldn't be able to get by. You'd have to take the drug. Now, of course, you can say, well, what happens? You can put a patch on to get you through the flight. Well, that is certainly true. But we also see that any of the other methods are not as effective. So let's start looking at some of the kind of aspects of kind of what is it that cigarettes are and why or how do we learn to become addicted to them. And I quite like this idea of a man on a treadmill running without a real kind of clue. So we use specific terminology for this. We call it cue reactivity. Cue reactivity. So what it says is that the pleasurable effects of smoking is a primary reinforcer. At no point am I denying the biology. I'm not saying, oh, it's not anything to do about the biology. There could well be social aspects to it. But certainly what happens is the brain's dopamine response will be triggered and you will be rewarded. Okay? So, how does the person become addicted? Well, of course, if it is rewarding, you're more likely to want to repeat the rewarding behavior. Okay, so this is the kicker. Of course, the biological model will say, well, it's just that repeating to the reward that is important. But of course, we also know that there's this thing called association. Through the learning model, we find that there are going to be other stimuli that get associated with that reward. Okay, so every time a person smokes a cigarette and is rewarded, they are drawing some kind of an association between the things that they do and that pleasure. Now, these are called secondary reinforcers. Now, of course, we need to not deny the kind of the difficulty of how exactly does that, why does one thing become a secondary reinforcer and something doesn't? But you often find that somebody who smokes has particular habit patterns related to those particular behavior. So it's the feel of the cigarettes, it's the people that they smoke with, it's the behavior that's associated with buying cigarettes and opening them and lighting them, and all of those types of things. And so what we find is that this secondary enforcer becomes rewarding in their own right. And of course, things that remind us of the rewards are the things that will always then trigger some kind of cue that we need to smoke. Now, if you want to have a look at some kind of evidence or some kind of research that kind of says that, it says these smoking related cues quickly become conditioned, okay? And this is the key here, that if we do brain imaging scans, the same areas of the brain that was activated by the nicotine, by the dopamine, get activated at the same time as those cues. So if I'm a non-smoker, I may not appreciate this. But if I am a smoker, and if I'm trying to give up smoking, and then I see my favorite ashtray, or I hang out with the friends that I used to smoke with, my brain is getting all these signals to say, come on, buddy, this is it. We need to be smoking. We need to have this kind of sensation within us. So what I'm saying in terms of cue reactivity, okay, that when a person smokes a cigarette, there are places, there are environmental things that are happening at the same time. Often people who smoke go out and smoke with colleagues, or you go to a pub, or you have your favorite lighter, or you have your favorite ashtray. Now, there could also be other repeated associations, okay? So sometimes it could be the feel of the box. I know in terms of speaking to family members who smoked, they used to have a smoke break. And if you were not a smoker, you didn't get the smoke break. So that's a massive rewarding aspect of being a smoker. You get that association that the time on the clock where you get to go out to a particular place and smoke with your colleagues. Some people have also said that you can actually get used to the way that the smoke kind of hits your lungs. Okay, now I have tried to smoke, wasn't very successful, but I do know that having something hot, burning, kind of drawn through your lungs, drawn through your throat into your lungs, can actually be incredibly difficult to deal with. Most people cough a lot. Okay, even that can become rewarding. If the first time you inhale some smoke and you cough your lungs out and you're spluttering and you feel like you're going to die, you might be with a group of friends and everybody's laughing and everybody's having fun. So once again, rewarding. Those repeated associations are what kind of makes the person go back to smoking. Now, you might also feel that this can't be as strong as the biology. However, of course, we are creatures of habits, and of course, smoking is habitual because we know that in order to kind of top up the nicotine within our system, we typically have to smoke a certain amount of cigarettes in a day, and so therefore that becomes habit forming. My dad smoked 20 cigarettes a day, and it was almost as if there was a pattern to his smoking. From the first thing he did when he got up in the morning, to his walk to work, to kind of coming home and sitting in front of the TV to smoke. Okay, so all of these stimuli ultimately act as cues. So if you think about it, and I don't really want to offend here, but let's say you are going through a terrible breakup with somebody. It's kind of a bit like that. Every time you see something or hear something or see the particular person, it could be really difficult to deal with the breakup because you have all those cues that are kind of triggering that emotional response. Now, that's all that I'm kind of saying that the cigarettes are doing, are triggering that type of response in the brain. And what it says here, it produces a similar physiological and psychological response to the nicotine itself. So, in other words, what I'm saying is it's not just the cigarettes themselves that give you a response, it's all these other cues that give you the response as well. Now, what we can do if we want to add detail to this, because that's all we need in terms of cue reactivity, is to simply to say, well, if I want to talk a little bit deeper about these particular kind of cues, we see that they produce, it says here, subjective desire or cravings for a cigarette. Okay, we also will have physiological signs, so things like being anxious or heart rate increasing or some kind of, you know, anxiety response of your skin temperature changing and things like that. But also your objective behavior, so kind of your kind of thoughts and feelings. Most people who smoke cigarettes almost know exactly how many times they need to kind of draw from the cigarette before they are finished. So all of those are adding to your addictive behavior. Now, what it just simply says, cues associated previously with receiving nicotine increase the likelihood that the smoker will respond by smoking. Okay, now what we can do is to kind of turn this into an evaluation points, because it says here the availability of cigarettes or the smell of tobacco or any of those types of things in themselves could actually be what is kind of starting you or stopping you from giving up. Okay, so there's application here, this idea that actually in order to kind of help a person, we need to kind of break that cue association. We need to to learn how to stop somebody from being able to act on their particular behavior of wanting to smoke. Now, in lessons, I can discuss this a little bit more, but I feel that I want to think about how you can turn this into an evaluation point. Now, one of the ways you could do it is to use this Hogarth study, because what they said here is that the amount of cravings increased when you had conditioned stimuluses. So in other words, if I realistically want somebody to give up smoking, they need to not have these cues. If I go into an environment, it's kind of like if this wasn't about smoking, this was about drinking. You know, if I've got a alcoholic with me, I perhaps don't want to offer them a beer or take them to a pub. It's the same type of thing with smoking. This idea that those cues can trigger that type of craving response. Now, the evaluation points are very similar to what we see previously. It's going to be research support, okay? And it's just going to say that these condition cues are more likely to increase relapse on people. Now, what they did is they took a group of participants and they had different environments. So one environment predicted that smoking was allowed, and another environment said smoking was not allowed. Okay, so you can imagine it. You know, you could have massive signs up saying smoking prohibited, or you know, you have, you know, kind of all these kind of like, you know, posters up with people's kind of lungs bleeding and whatever it could be. That's would be the predicted that you weren't allowed to smoke. In contrast, you could have a different environment where there's an ashtray on the table, there's matches for you to light cigarettes. You could even have cigarettes easily available for sale or whatever it could be. Okay, so based on those two particular situations and then feeding back of the participants, it's quite simple and very, very basic, kind of stating the obvious. Okay, that if you had a cue that predicted smoking, it just simply said that the urge was greater. Okay, so in other words, if you do have a friend who wants to give up smoking, you need to kind of avoid places that are going to trigger those cues. Now, the good thing about any explanation for addictive behavior that is learning based, because there are going to be these implications for treatment, because I really do actually appreciate the learning model, because it's one of the few models that says that you can cure somebody, that you can actually fix somebody. Okay, because if your addiction is learned, okay, it means that it can be unlearned. Now, I do have some ideas on how to do this, and one of the ideas is this thing called cue exposure treatment. Okay, so what it says is that if I take a person who's trying to give up smoking and I put them in an environment where they can't engage in smoking, where they can't give in to the urges, okay, that ultimately that will be a conflicting stimulus, and ultimately it will start kind of extinguishing their desire to smoke. Okay, now I'm not exactly sure how this works, but what you would expect is that you're pretty much wanting them to kind of recognize that it's actually quite unpleasant for them to be in that particular environment rather than them being pleasant. Now, I was able to find something, and I'm hoping that this works. And certainly, if the audio doesn't come through, and I can only check this afterwards, we might have to just kind of have a look at it again. Okay, so this is taking a different situation now. Okay, and it's taking somebody who is a oh, I can't get it to work, of course. Why isn't it working? There we go. Now, if you can't hear the audio, you can certainly hear a pub environment. So this type of VR treatment was used with alcoholics. Okay, so obviously if I'm using VR, I can't actually drink. Okay, and so what you're doing, you're using
What can I get you to drink?
you, you're getting a therapeutic process in which they can't actually participate in the drinking. Now, of course, this could be used for smoking. Okay. Now, I know this isn't a brilliant example, but I'm hoping that you can see that type of practical idea that you're trying to put them into an environment where they have this cue exposure, but they aren't actually being exposed to smoking. Now, that is the content that you can completely finish with in terms of your learning theory. But one of the things that I did spot when I was looking specifically at smoking is that there may well be a gender difference between smoking, and what I'm kind of trying to kind of look at is that maybe a limitation of the learning model, and perhaps a limitation of a lot of our understanding of smoking, is this acknowledging the differences between men and women. Okay, and so I've got some research that potentially support this. So, firstly, we know that men and women may smoke for different reasons. Okay, it says here women start smoking later, often related to relationships, I'm afraid to say. This is also for other drug use as well. And that often the context of their smoking may well actually be quite different. What I can explain by the context, it says here, men are more likely to smoke in a stressful situation. Okay, and therefore you could say that it's kind of this self-medication type of model that the cigarette's going to make them feel better. So women are more likely than men to light up in the stressful situation. So the self-medication, and men, on the other hand, often will smoke up as a means of social kind of acceptance and kind of rejection of society. It also says here women also experience withdrawal effects sooner and have a harder time giving up. So there could well be a biological component between men and women that once a woman has started smoking, that's actually harder for them to give up. Okay, so what does that mean? Remember, my point was about gender differences. Okay, so what I'm saying here is potentially the learning theory fails to address these differences. So therefore, it's an inadequate explanation of why we smoke, because if it was a good enough explanation, we would literally have an explanation for both men and women that would pretty much be the same. I do have a little diagram that I copied from the internet somewhere, perhaps saying, well, actually, there's other differences between men and women. Sometimes it's the actual drugs that they take. Things like cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines are often associated with males, and women are more likely to misuse prescription drugs and tranquilizers. And so it could be stress, anxiety, as opposed to kind of social or kind of macho kind of behavior that men do. So it would be a really great idea for you perhaps to explore some of those ideas. Now, just to finish with, in terms of the lesson, I did say there are a few types of questions that could come up. These are two examples of short essay questions. Now, what we see from the first one, it just simply says one or more explanations. In some ways, this is a harder one to do because you have two explanations. You have both your biology or your brain neurochemistry and you have your learning theory, but you only have 3 marks that you want to put towards your knowledge. So I'd personally say write about one explanation rather than both. But we also see that they may ask a specific way. Okay, so for both of these particular explanations, you need to know them individually and you need to be able to write them individually. There's also short questions as well. So if you are preparing for an exam, you also need to just know some facts or knowledge about these. And we see quite literally, they want you to know about dopamine in the first one, and they want to know about learning in the next one. So there we have. It doesn't take long to go through explanations of specific addictions like smoking and gambling. And there we have finished the first section of this. And I will be going through the explanations of gambling in my next video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you soon.